method. The percent of the receivables method can be done in two ways. We can use the percent of accounts receivable or an aging schedule, aging of accounts receivable. There are two steps in order to calculate the amount for the journal entry. The first one is to do an estimate of the allowance using one of these two methods. The percent of receivables would just be the same thing as percent of sales, but we'll be taking a percent of the accounts receivable account as a whole. We'll be going over the aging of accounts receivable as well coming up in a few slides. First, we'll just start really with the percent of accounts receivable because it's easier. You still follow the same steps when you get the estimate though. Use one of these methods to get the estimate of the allowance. Now, normally with the percent of the sales, we would just do the percent, that's us estimating the allowance, and then journalizing that number. We have a second step here. We have to look at the balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts account. This can be a little tricky, and I'll try my best to explain why this is. Let's just use the percent of sales method first. In 2019, we had sales of 100,000 and 2020 sales of 150,000. Let's say it's 10% that we believe is uncollectible. We'll do 10% of the 100,000 in one year and 10% of the 150,000 in the next year. These numbers are completely independent of one another. My sales of 100,000 in 2019 are not included in my sales of 2020. We're not duplicating any information when we do 10% of both these numbers. Doing 10% of this 150,000 would have nothing to do with this 100,000 here. Now let's look at the percent of accounts receivable method. In 2019, we had accounts receivable of 20,000, and in 2020, we had accounts receivable of 15,000. If we just did, let's say, 10% of each of these numbers, that would be the percent of accounts receivable for that year. However, the issue is some of this 20,000 might be included in this 15,000 here. If there's a client that owed us money in 2019, it could have carried over to 2020. Now, ideally, hopefully we'd write off these clients who have owed us money for more than a year. Let's say John Smith owed us $1,000 in 2019 and never paid us. Now it's 2020, his $1,000 that he owes us is still included in this number right here. If we did 10% of 2019 and 10% of 2020 to write off, we would be duplicating an amount. We'd be doing 10% of this one client's account, and we would be doing it again in the next year. I know this sounds a little confusing, and I'm just explaining why. If you don't really understand what I'm talking about, that's okay. Just kind of memorize the steps that we're doing. But basically, we have to look at the allowance account because we don't want to have duplicate information in there. Percent of sales, we don't have to worry about that because it's all new information, but percent of accounts receivable can carry over year after year after year, and we won't be writing off the same information over and over and over again. Therefore, when we do this method, we'll have to do the estimate of the allowance. We'll use a percent of the accounts receivable, or we'll do the aging schedule. Well, that's coming up next. And then we'll have to subtract that from the previous balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts to come up with the bad debt expense, the amount we journalize. Here's a little tip. If the balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts had a credit balance, we're going to subtract. If it had a debit balance, we're going to add the numbers together. The last method we're going to learn is the aging of receivables method. Remember, the aging of receivables method is still done the same way of the percent of receivables method. The only difference is we're not just going to take a flat rate, like a flat percent with all of the receivables. We're going to divide the receivables into different categories. We're going to classify each receivable by how long it's past due. We're under the assumption that the longer something is past due, the more likely we're not going to collect it. If someone is only maybe a month late of paying me, I can still assume that I might get that money. If someone is 6 months late in paying me, I can probably assume that I'm not going to get that. We're going to have different percentages based on how long an account is past due. The longer it's past due, the percent of it being uncollectible will increase. That's why this method is different than percent of receivables. Percent of receivables takes a whole chunk and just multiplies it by 1%. We're going to take those who aren't that late and multiply that by percent, and then those who are really late, multiply that by a different percent.